Since welcoming agro-giant Monsanto into the country in 1996, Argentina has become the world's largest soybean producer. Today, nearly 100% of its soy crop is genetically altered, with Monsanto providing much of the pesticides used in the country. But we're now learning that this overabundance of chemicals isn't just confined to Argentina's crops. A new AP report shows that they're having enormous effects on the 12 million people who live in the country's farm belt. The AP has documented dozens of cases around the country where poisons are applied in ways that are contrary to existing laws. Pesticides are showing up in the soil and drinking water, and a government report found 80% of children surveyed had traces of pesticide in their blood. As a result, people are becoming very sick. In Santa Fe, Argentina, cancer rates are 2 to 4 times higher than the national average. And in another province called Chaco, birth defects have quadrupled. But Monsanto denies that health problems in the country are caused by its pesticides. A spokesman tells the AP, quote, "The absence of reliable data makes it very difficult to establish trends in disease incidence and even more difficult to establish causal relationships. To our knowledge, there are no established causal relationships." However, many in Argentina are calling on Monsanto to take responsibility for their products, which more and more people are protesting. To discuss this, along with the latest news on the GMO front, I was joined earlier by Elizabeth Kucinich, Director of Policy at the Center for Food Safety. I started by asking her why GMOs require the use of such strong chemicals.
They're actually developed by chemical companies, not necessarily as you would be led to believe to increase yields or to increase nutrition, but really to be able to withstand and resist chemicals. So there are plants that are pesticide-resistant crops, such as Roundup-ready crops that you hear about, and there are also those that actually produce pesticides themselves. So it's the chemical companies really that have made this wonderful business model for themselves, in that they create a seed that is resistant to the types of chemicals that they want to apply to them. So for example, Roundup-ready corn is resistant to Roundup, which is the chemical that goes on it, or glyphosate, which is actually called. So we see that it's just an actual partnering of the two technologies.
Wow. Well, what kinds of effects are these pesticides having on human health? And, why are we really learning about them now, sort of 15 years after they were initially put into use in Argentina?
Yeah, well, actually, all across the world, we've known about pesticide poisoning. It's an everyday occurrence, very sadly, among farm workers and people who live in rural communities that are neighboring fields and plantations that are being sprayed with pesticides. So we've known about it for a long time. It is a big issue in the United States as well as in countries like Argentina that you've just brought up. But I'm very glad that people are actually listening to it and actually becoming more aware of it now.
Absolutely. And of course, Monsanto is rejecting this claim outright, saying that the pesticides are not causing this, that there's no causal link. They say the absence of reliable data means it's difficult to establish that link. So what do you make of that argument?
We need more data. I mean, there clearly is an issue with data collection on so many different levels. And when we look at the United States, regulation is that many of the companies just have to submit their own data. There isn't independent data called for, no legal requirement for it. So we need to make sure that this is something that we really push for as a community of people that are very concerned about environmental health and also obviously public health.
But interestingly, regardless of that, in May of this year, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency actually raised the amount of chemical residue that's going to be allowed in food. And they concluded this based on studies done by Monsanto and only by Monsanto. Do you find it concerning at all that the U.S. is really, making regulation and making these guidelines based off of?
Well, it's the fox guarding the hen house. It's the person with financial incentives that's actually saying whether something is safe or not safe. That's not what regulation is all about, and we need to make sure that FDA really stands up and that we actually have regulations with teeth in them to make sure that public health, environmental health are protected.
Sure. Let's switch gears to another country, Mexico, which is making waves for banning genetically modified foods outright. How big of a win is this? And do you think this decision really could have implications for the anti-GMO movement within the United States, considering the countries border each other?
You know, there are many countries that have different levels of bans of different GMO crops, and the Mexico suspension is obviously a move in a good direction in that it will cause for a lot of more conversation, just like you and I having. But in reality, there have been bans that have been put in place that have been overturned relatively quickly, much as that have been put in place through judicial responses. And we need to make sure that industry doesn't pressure governments, that we make sure that actually public dialogue goes to the point that we really do have regulation, as I said before, that has some kind of teeth to make sure that public health is protected. And we look as well at trade laws such as NAFTA. Yucatan Peninsula had a ban put in place, but it was overturned because Monsanto were threatening that they would sue for damages of potential future losses as ruled in NAFTA. So we have to make sure that our trade agreements also don't undermine our future protections.
Absolutely. And let's talk about the United States, because it seems like more and more states are really taking the initiative to ban GMOs, or at least label them. Can you talk about what's specifically going on in the state of Washington, and how that really compares to what we saw happen in California? What kind of outcome do you think we'll see there?
So Washington State right now has an initiative, I-522, that's on the ballot. The ballots have all gone out, so hopefully people are mailing them back in saying, yes, we want GMO labeling. There's an enormous amount of money that's being pumped in by industry and Grocery Manufacturers Association, which represents big food, trying to stop people from being able to know what is in their food and the processes that have gone into growing their food. We need to stand up for everybody's right to know, because we don't know the long-term effects of these things, but we do have the right to know the ways in which our food is produced and the levels of pesticides that we may be exposed to. And when we look at the kinds of foods that there are, just general labeling, we see organic, we see in supermarkets conventional. We don't see GMOs, but we can understand that if we're looking at a corn or a soy product particularly, that it will generally be genetically modified unless it says non-GMO or organic. And when we look at these three systems of agriculture, we can see that GMOs, really because of the partnering of the chemical applications with seed development, that they would be extremely contaminated with pesticides, conventional would be moderately contaminated, and organic would be minimally contaminated and is about as pure as we can get in the United States. So just as a general guide for people, we need to make sure that if and where possible, you buy organic.
Absolutely. Well, there's certainly a huge momentum right now that we're seeing all over the world. And so hopefully that momentum continues.
Absolutely.
I do appreciate you coming on and
Thank you.
sharing your insight. Elizabeth Kucinich, Director of Policy at the Center for Food Safety. Thank you.
Thank you.